What if the real heartbeat of the Harlem Renaissance wasn't just in the music, but in the food that fueled it? Imagine fried chicken sizzling in the kitchen, sweet potato pie cooling on the counter, and plates of smothered pork chops or collard greens sliding across tables as jazz poured through smoky rooms. From 1920s supper clubs to 1940s neighborhood diners, African American restaurants weren't just places to eat. They were cultural sanctuaries where flavor, community, and history came alive. Here are 25 foods served in African American restaurants in the 1920s to the 1940s. Fried chicken. Can you hear that sound? Oh yes, that's the sound of fried chicken hitting hot oil, a rhythm so powerful it practically feels like the joy of jazz in the skillet. Many African Americans in the South perfected the art of turning a simple bird into a feast fit for royalty. Back during slavery and after emancipation, chickens were among the few animals enslaved people were allowed to raise. That freedom turned into a good business venture for them after they learned to season and fry chicken in ways that made every bite unforgettable. By the 1920s and 40s, fried chicken was no longer just sustenance. It was a badge of pride. Jazz musicians would grab a plate after gigs, families packed it for road trips, and it was the star at Sunday dinners. Its portability made it popular at picnics and church socials, while its flavor made it legendary in Harlem restaurants and Southern cafes alike. This masterpiece was made with chicken soaked in buttermilk for tenderness, rolled in flour, spiked with salt, black pepper, garlic powder, paprika, and just enough cayenne to make the tongue dance. Drop it in bubbling oil and watch as the crust forms a golden shield while the inside stays juicy and tender. The final outcome is a crunchy bite that balances well with your taste buds. Sweet potato pie. What's sweeter than jazz at midnight? Sweet potato pie cooling on grandma's windowsill, filling the air with cinnamon and nutmeg. African Americans took the humble sweet potato, a crop tied to survival during slavery, and transformed it into a dessert so iconic, it outshone pumpkin pie in flavor and soul. Unlike pumpkin, sweet potatoes carried depth, history, and a richness that made one slice feel like both a hug and a celebration. During the 1920s to 40s, sweet potato pie was a fixture at church suppers, holiday spreads, and cafe counters in black neighborhoods. To serve a good sweet potato pie meant you understood the delicate balance of sweetness and spice, the patience it took to roast, mash, and whip the potatoes to silky perfection is top-notch. This delicacy is made from a blend of creamy mashed sweet potatoes mixed with butter, sugar, eggs, milk, vanilla, cinnamon, and nutmeg, all cradled in a flaky crust. Baked until the filling set firm yet tender, the pie emerged as a masterpiece, glowing golden orange. Collard greens. When you walk into a room where there is a pot simmering on the back of the stove with steam rising slowly, while the scent of smoked meat and greens fills the air. That's collard greens, often called soul in a pot. This dish was born from African roots and survival in America. Cheap and hearty collards grew year-round and became a dependable staple for African American families. But rather than boiling them plain, cooks transformed them into works of art, seasoning them with smoked ham hocks, turkey, onions, and spice until the flavor wrapped around you like comfort. During the 1920s to 40s, collard greens were the go-to foods for family reunions and dinner tables, often in giant pots that could feed entire neighborhoods. Restaurants proudly served collards as a side dish that carried just as much weight as the main course. The juice left behind in the pot, that was pot liquor, liquid gold. Some drank it like soup, others sopped it up with cornbread. Either way, it was considered the essence of the greens, and nothing was wasted. Chopped collard greens boiled low and slow with onions, garlic, red pepper flakes, smoked turkey, or ham hocks, and finished with a splash of vinegar is exactly how this giant pot is brought to life. The result is tender greens that balance smoky, spicy, and tangy all in one bite. Cornbread. See that golden square sitting proudly on the table? That's cornbread, glowing like treasure, fresh out of a skillet. With roots in Native American traditions, cornbread became a backbone of African American kitchens, where cornmeal was plentiful, cheap, and versatile. It could be baked, fried, or crumbled into stews, but its most beloved form was the skillet-baked loaf, with crispy edges and a soft, warm center. By the 1920s to 40s, cornbread was the glue of every meal. It soaked up pot liquor from collard greens, balanced the spice of beans, and sat comfortably beside fried chicken. At cafes and restaurants, it was served in thick wedges or squares, sometimes sweetened, sometimes plain. Families argued over sugar in the batter, but one thing was certain: cornbread was the ultimate comfort food. The ingredients include cornmeal mixed with flour, eggs, milk or buttermilk, baking powder, a little sugar, depending on tradition, and butter heated in the skillet before the batter hit the pan. That hot butter formed a crust so crisp you could hear it crack when cut, while the inside stayed fluffy and tender. Black-eyed peas. Let's talk about the famous black-eyed peas, with their tiny dark spots carrying more meaning than most foods on the table. African traditions tied them to fertility and prosperity, and in the American South, eating black-eyed peas on New Year's Day promised wealth and good fortune. For African Americans in the 1920s to 40s, this belief made them more than beans. They were hope in edible form. Restaurants and homes alike served black-eyed peas simmered into savory stews or combined with rice to create Hoppin' John, a dish that filled bellies and also served as a symbol of abundance. In neighborhoods that were hit the hardest by poverty, a single pot of black-eyed peas could stretch across several meals, feeding families and visitors with ease. They were often paired with collards, representing money, and cornbread, representing gold, to create a trio of good fortune. The key ingredients for making this sweet meal include black-eyed peas simmered slowly with onions, garlic, celery, smoked ham hocks or bacon, salt, black pepper, and a hint of cayenne for heat. Add rice, and you had a dish that was not just filling, but celebratory. But wait, if fried chicken, sweet potato pie, and collard greens brought this much fire, can you even imagine what we have lined up on the list next, are about to unleash? Stay tuned for more. Macaroni and cheese. Golden, bubbling, and irresistible goodness, macaroni and cheese was comfort food that walked straight into African American kitchens and made itself at home. The dish actually traces back to Europe, but enslaved chefs in Virginia and the Carolinas elevated it, blending creamy cheese with pasta until it became pure velvet on a fork. By the 1920s to 40s, macaroni and cheese wasn't just a dish, it was the superstar of Sunday dinners and special occasions. Made from elbow macaroni boiled to tender perfection, blanketed in a rich sauce made of butter, milk, flour, and sharp cheddar cheese. Sprinkle more cheese on top, bake it until golden and bubbling, and you've got a crown jewel that could silence an entire dinner table. For African American families, mac and cheese quickly topped the rank of artistry. A pan of baked macaroni symbolized abundance, and at cafe counters in Harlem or at Southern church gatherings, it was often the first dish to vanish. Each creamy bite carried the history of enslaved chefs like James Hemings, who brought the recipe from France and made it uniquely American. By the time the Harlem Renaissance boomed, mac and cheese was soul food royalty. Every forkful told a story of transformation, humble ingredients turned into elegance. Rich, filling, and beloved, macaroni and cheese held a power that was both cultural and culinary. It wasn't just about eating, it was about savoring a legacy baked right into the pan. Corn pudding. Sweet, creamy, and rich. Corn pudding was the dish that reminded everyone of harvest, abundance, and comfort. African Americans took the simplicity of corn, a grain deeply tied to Native and African diets, and transformed it into a custard-like miracle. By the 1920s to 40s, this golden pudding was a beloved side dish at both Southern suppers and Northern restaurants serving migrant communities. This creamy richness is made from fresh or canned corn kernels, milk, sugar, eggs, butter, and a touch of flour or cornmeal baked until the mixture sets into a silky golden pudding. Some recipes added nutmeg or vanilla for extra charm. Corn pudding was comfort disguised as luxury. It was often made during holidays, where its sweetness balanced the savory tang of collard greens, ham hocks, or fried chicken. Restaurants proudly served it as the perfect counterpoint to smoky barbecue or spicy gumbo. Its silky texture and sweet savory flavor made it unforgettable. Corn pudding was so good that only one spoonful was enough to transport diners back home, back to warmth, laughter, and a time when simple foods carried the deepest comforts. Beef neck bones. Now here's a dish that came straight out of resourcefulness. Beef neck bones. Cheap, often overlooked but packed with flavor, they became a staple in African American kitchens. During the 1920s to 40s, when money was scarce and families were large, beef neck bones proved that even the toughest cuts could be turned into magic. You too can get yourself a plate of this simple goodness with only a few steps that starts with beef neck bones simmered low and slow with onions, garlic, carrots, celery, and seasonings until the meat falls tender from the bone. And you can go ahead to pair it with rice, beans, or collard greens. They transformed into hearty stews that warmed entire households. Restaurants during this era often tucked beef neck bones into menus as working man's food because of its hearty, filling, and cheap nature. Migrant workers in the North found comfort in the dish, reminding them of Southern kitchens where nothing went to waste. It was the kind of meal that stretched across days, feeding families with leftovers and soups made from the rich broth. Pickled pig's feet. Now let's get bold with pickled pig's feet. The name alone might raise eyebrows, but for African Americans between the 1920s and 40s, this dish was both a snack and a cultural statement. It carried roots from Europe and Africa, but became uniquely tied to Southern cooking, where nothing from the hog went to waste. Ingredients? All you need is a pig's feet boiled until tender, then marinated in a tangy brine of vinegar, onions, garlic, salt, black pepper, and red pepper flakes. The result? Meat so soft it melted off the bone with a tangy, spicy punch that woke up the palate. Pickled pig's feet were often sold in jars at cafes, bars, and juke joints, sitting on counters like trophies. Patrons would grab them for late-night snacks after music-filled evenings. They were cheap, accessible, and full of flavor. More importantly, they carried the tradition of whole animal cooking. By the Harlem Renaissance, pickled pig's feet symbolized creativity and boldness. They weren't fancy, but they were unforgettable. Eating them was part tradition, part rebellion, part celebration. The tang lingered, the texture surprised, and the memory stuck. Liver and onions. One whiff of liver and onions cooking in a pan, and you're instantly transported to kitchens of the 1930s, where practicality met deep, savory flavor. Liver was cheap, nutritious, and always available, making it a common dish in African American households during the 1920s to 40s. But onions turned it into something greater, balancing bitterness with sweetness until the dish sang with soul. The ingredients are very simple. All you need are pieces of sliced beef or chicken liver, dredged lightly in flour, fried in butter, and topped with onions caramelized to golden perfection. A splash of broth or gravy often tied the flavors together. For many African American families, the liver and onion dish was mainly appreciated for its richness in iron and protein that fueled workers and children during lean years. It was the dish you ate before heading to long shifts in fields, factories, or construction sites. Restaurants featured it as hearty fare, feeding customers who wanted something filling at a low price. While not everyone loved liver, those who did swore by its depth and richness. The sweetness of the onions made each bite satisfying, balancing the strong flavor of the meat. The plot thickens like gravy on Sunday dinner because the next foods aren't just meals, they're legends. Get ready to have your taste buds blown away with the old 20s flavors. Peach cobbler. Peach cobbler was more than just dessert. It was the sweet final piece that closed out Sunday suppers and holiday feasts. Let's go back to a Southern kitchen in the 1930s, where the air was filled with laughter, gospel humming from the radio, and the scent of peaches ripening in a basket by the window. Those peaches, golden and dripping with juice, were sliced and then tossed with brown sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and just a squeeze of lemon to bring out their brightness. They were poured into a deep pan, the syrup already starting to bubble, then covered with a dough that was part biscuit, part pastry, rolled out by hands that had long ago mastered the art of stretching flour and butter into miracles. When the cobbler slid into the oven, it was no longer just fruit and dough. It became a promise that families gathered around the table, waiting for the bubbling golden dish to emerge. The end game came with edges that are caramelized and sticky, and a smell that was enough to make mouths water. Each bite carried stories of finding sweetness even in lean times. Peach cobbler was a memory made edible, a dessert that comforted and celebrated, a tradition passed from one generation to the next with the reverence of Scripture. It brought light to every dinner table, no matter how hard the week had been. Banana pudding. If peach cobbler was the grand finale, banana pudding was the standing ovation. Smooth, cool, and layered with love, it stood at the center of countless church socials, family reunions, and neighborhood gatherings. Think with me for a minute about a time where Grandma was in the kitchen, apron tied snug, reaching for the box of vanilla wafers that would form the foundation. Each wafer was a cornerstone, lining the dish with promise. Next came the bananas, ripe and sweet, sliced into perfect coins that layered like golden treasure. Then came the custard, warm and velvety, made from milk, sugar, eggs, and a touch of vanilla, whisked until it gleamed with richness. When it poured over the bananas and wafers, it sealed the layers together like a covenant of flavor. To crown it all, whipped topping or meringue was spread across the top, toasted lightly for flair, or left pillowy and soft. When the spoon finally dipped in, it was more than dessert being served. It was the nostalgic feeling of childhood summers in a plate. Banana pudding's genius lay in its simplicity. No expensive ingredients, no elaborate steps, just patience, care, and the desire to feed souls as well as bellies. Each bite brought comfort like a cool breeze on a hot day. Fried green tomatoes. Now picture this. A backyard garden in the heat of summer, vines heavy with tomatoes that refuse to turn red just yet. Waste nothing, that was the rule. And so those firm, tart green tomatoes became the star of their own story. They were sliced thick, their insides still crisp and sharp with tang. Each round was dipped first in buttermilk, then dredged through a mix of cornmeal, flour, salt, and black pepper until it wore its new golden coat. Into the hot skillet it went, boiling hot and popping with the smell of frying batter mixing with the laughter of family nearby. When lifted from the pan, the tomatoes were golden brown, crisp at the edges, yet tender inside. The first bite was always a surprise, tangy, crunchy, and utterly addictive. Fried green tomatoes were the definition of turning what you had into what you wanted. They served as a show of creativity in the kitchen and as proof that with a little ingenuity, even unripe fruit could become a delicacy. Pan-fried trout. In rivers and streams across the South, trout was caught fresh, sometimes early in the morning before the sun had stretched itself across the sky. Fishermen and families alike knew the value of this shimmering catch, its skin sparkling like silver in the light. Once brought home, the trout was cleaned with care, seasoned with salt, pepper, and maybe a touch of paprika if it was on hand. Flour dusted the fish like fresh snow, sealing in its flavor. Then came the pan, heavy and hot, butter melting and hissing as the trout hit the surface with a satisfying sizzling sound. The skin crisped, golden and delicate, while the inside flaked into tender perfection. A squeeze of lemon juice or a sprig of herbs elevated it to something close to divine. Candied yams. Few dishes spark such anticipation at the table as candied yams. When the oven door opened and the sweet, spiced aroma filled the room, everyone knew it was time for something extraordinary. Thick slices of orange yams were layered into a pan, each piece gleaming like a jewel. Over them, melted butter was poured, rich and golden, followed by a generous sprinkling of brown sugar that rained down like confetti. Cinnamon and nutmeg added warmth, while a drizzle of molasses or honey deepened the sweetness until it was almost sinful. As the pan baked slowly, the sugar and butter melted together into a syrup, coating each yam in glossy perfection. The edges were usually sticky and irresistible, while the centers grew soft and creamy. When served, candied yams were mouth-watering to be eaten as a side dish that carried the spirit of abundance and making something beautiful out of what the soil gave freely. For many African American restaurants back in the 1920s and 1930s, this dish represented the tradition of hospitality and love of the people being poured into every layer on the holiday tables and at Sunday dinners. Candied yams had the power to silence chatter with a sweetness that brought joy with every forkful. What's coming next will make you lean closer, stomach growling, eyes wide with the secrets of survival, culture, and triumph that they carry. Ready to taste the next chapter of history? Hold on tight to your seats. Oxtail stew. Step into a 1930s African-American restaurant, and you'd likely see a pot simmering in the back, heavy with oxtails bubbling in rich broth. Oxtails were browned in a hot pan, their marrow giving off an aroma that made stomachs rumble. Onions, garlic, carrots, and celery joined the pot, releasing a perfume that filled the dining room. The oxtails were then left to braise for hours, soaking up the flavors of bay leaves, thyme, black pepper, and sometimes a dash of hot sauce. By the time it reached the table, the meat slid off the bone. Tender and silky, the broth thick and full-bodied. In restaurants of the era, oxtail stew wasn't just food. It was a show of mastery, proof that chefs could turn the humble into the heavenly. Customers ordered it not only because it was hearty, but because it carried the taste of resilience, a story in every spoonful. Served with rice, cornbread, or potatoes, it became a dish of comfort, one that wrapped diners in warmth no matter what struggles waited outside those doors. Barbecue ribs. Now imagine stepping into a smoke-filled dining hall where laughter mingles with the crackle of burning wood. At the center of the menu, barbecue ribs, shining under the heat, dripping with tangy sauce. These ribs weren't rushed. They were slow cooked over pits or ovens, basted with a blend of molasses, vinegar, tomato paste, and secret spices each restaurant swore was its own. The meat clung to the bone, then gave way easily at the first bite, leaving sauce-stained fingers and satisfied grins. Restaurants from the 1920s to 1940s turned ribs into events. Patrons leaned over checkered tables, rolling up sleeves, savoring each smoky bite with sides of collard greens or potato salad. African-American restaurants during this era didn't just serve food. They served culture, and ribs became the star attraction, an anthem of flavor and pride. Turnip greens. Not every dish on the restaurant menu had to be heavy with meat. Turnip greens joined the list with earthy flavor and nutritious punch, balancing out rich main courses. In kitchens, cooks washed the leaves carefully, then simmered them down in seasoned broth flavored with smoked ham hocks or turkey necks. Onions and garlic joined the pot, with a touch of vinegar added at the end for brightness. The result? Greens tender enough to melt on the tongue, yet bold with flavor. Diners appreciated them not only for their taste, but for what they represented, turning simple farm produce into dishes fit for the table of any restaurant. By the 1930s, no soul food menu felt complete without greens, turnip, mustard, or collard because they embodied health, thrift, and tradition. When served, turnip greens were often paired with cornbread, which acted like a sponge to soak up the pot liquor, that savory broth left behind. Customers craved that juice just as much as the greens themselves. Mustard greens. While collard and turnip greens had their fans, mustard greens came with a peppery kick that set them apart. On restaurant menus of the 1920s and 1930s, they were the bold cousin of the leafy green family, cooked low and slow until their sharp edges mellowed into savory richness. Cooks often seasoned them with smoked meats, onions, chili flakes, and a splash of vinegar to brighten the dish. The broth they produced was as valuable as the greens themselves, prompting diners to tear off chunks of cornbread and dunk generously. Customers ordered them as companions to pork chops, ribs, or fried chicken, but in truth, mustard greens held their own. Their bite reminded diners of resilience, that food could carry both comfort and fire. Smothered pork chops. If any dish could hush a noisy restaurant in seconds, it was smothered pork chops arriving at the table. Imagine thick-cut chops, seasoned and pan-fried until golden, then bathed in a creamy onion gravy that bubbled and thickened over low heat. The smell alone drew eyes from every corner of the room. Restaurants served them over rice or mashed potatoes, letting the gravy soak deep into every grain. Customers leaned back in satisfaction after a few bites, their plates telling stories of indulgence. During the 1920s to 1940s, pork was affordable yet versatile, and cooks elevated it with gravies that became house signatures. Every restaurant had its own take, some with creamier bases, others with spicy edges. Smothered pork chops proved that African-American cuisine thrived on balance. Humble cuts transformed into dishes worth lining up for. To eat them was to experience generosity on a plate, food that filled both appetite and heart. The next dishes carry smoky secrets and soulful whispers. Are your taste buds brave enough to handle what's coming? Wait and see for yourself. Gumbo. Step into any southern restaurant and you'll find gumbo simmering like a story in a pot. This dish was originally born in Louisiana from way back, but creativity took another level when cooks began to blend gumbo with West African okra, French roux, and Native American filet powder into one flavorful masterpiece that the taste buds could not resist. If you want to know just how good this dish is, then picture with me right now some shrimp, sausage, or chicken swirling with bell peppers, onions, and celery, with the famous holy trinity of Cajun and Creole cooking in the kitchen. Then, after a while, the broth thickens slowly, with each stir deepening its richness until it's poured over a bowl of rice, and then you see the waiter coming over to your table and lays it down before you with all the good stuff staring right at you. Eating gumbo in a restaurant gives just the same joy as being welcomed into someone's home, as it tells you that no matter where you're from, there's room at the table for everybody to have a good meal and enjoy themselves while at it. Red beans and rice. If patience were a dish, it would be red beans and rice. Restaurants across the South honor this Monday classic slow-cooking kidney beans with smoky ham hocks or sausage until creamy perfection arrives as the final result. But don't be mistaken, cause the goodness of this combo is totally worth the while at long last. When you mix onions, garlic, celery, and peppers, that melts into a perfect mix, creating a savory base that hugs every grain of fluffy rice you combine them with. The rich aroma it gives off alone can stop conversations mid-sentence, as it both comforts and fills your belly at a go. Talk about enjoying life's goodness in one sitting. Once a humble way to stretch leftovers, red beans and rice now hold their place on restaurant menus as soul food royalty. With each spoonful, you taste resilience and rhythm, like a jazz note echoing from New Orleans itself. Chicken and dumplings. Few restaurant dishes hug the soul like chicken and dumplings. Tender chicken simmered in a savory broth that is seasoned with carrots, celery, and onions, while soft, doughy dumplings puff up on top like clouds. With every bite is a feeling of ingredients that melts into a velvety mix of warmth and nostalgia in your mouth. What started as a simple farmhouse dish has risen to a southern classic you'll find proudly served in diners and family restaurants alike. The dumplings, sometimes rolled flat, other times dropped in fluffy mounds, are the true stars of the show in many African American restaurants back in the days. They soak up every drop of that golden broth, turning a humble pot into a feast that says, "You're home." Rice pudding. When restaurants want to end your meal with a hug in a bowl, rice pudding makes its entrance. Creamy, sweet, and spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg, it transforms humble rice into dessert magic. Cooked slowly in milk and sugar, the grains soften until they're tender pearls in a custardy base. Some chefs fold in raisins for bursts of sweetness, while others crown it with whipped cream or caramel drizzle. This dish carries stories of grandmothers stirring pots on quiet evenings, yet it shines just as brightly on modern restaurant menus. Each spoonful feels like a pause, a gentle reminder that life's sweetest things often come from the simplest beginnings. Brunswick stew. Step into a southern barbecue joint, and you'll likely spot Brunswick stew, thick, smoky, and loaded with comfort. Its roots are hotly debated between Virginia and Georgia, but one thing is certain. It's unforgettable. This stew is made with a mix of chicken, pork, or beef, cooked with corn, lima beans, and tomatoes until the stew becomes a hearty, stick-to-your-ribs meal. A dash of barbecue sauce often sneaks in, giving it that signature tang restaurants are known for. Brunswick stew doesn't just fill your belly, but also carries the history of feeding the African American communities during the Renaissance era. Once cooked outdoors in massive pots for gatherings, it still carries that festive spirit into every restaurant bowl served today. Quick question, which of these foods did you ever get the chance to actually taste or maybe heard your nan talk about while growing up? Drop it in the comments below. We might feature your story in the next video.